Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone. As lesson 3, Backgrounds to the English Romantics of week 2, we'll look at the debate on rights. Something I've quoted before comes up on your slide immediately. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. William Blake's famous poem, London. It's about the recording of suffering. As we have argued before, it's about sensibility, about an awareness of other suffering, but it's also about social institutions, social failures of protection which you are looking at. The streets have been chartered, the river has been chartered. Chartered here actually means regulated. So it actually means people are kept out. It's a bit like the ghettos of the contemporary era, gated communities, private roads, private access, private entrances, and so on and so forth. These discourses of rights, as manifest in works of Tom Paine, but also embodied in poetry like William Blake's, emerged from the American and French revolutions. The revolutions threw up discourses about rights, about the role of citizens, the government, and monarchy. Political views from Tom Paine, William Godwin, and Edmund Burke, literary writings by Blake, Anna Letitia Babol, and Shelley, and the renewed interest in Milton and the rise of a whole discourse of the rights of women from Mary Wollstonecraft effected a major linkage between politics and literature. And therefore, we need to see the Romantic Age as a very politically astute and politically committed literature. Richard Price welcomed the revolution in France, and in the previous lesson we have already looked at Wordsworth and Coleridge, who also had a huge amount of interest in the revolution in France and the possible outcomes. In his book A Discourse on the Love of Our Country 1789, he anticipated similar events in England. A fervent supporter of parliamentary reform, Richard Price wrote enthusiastically about the ardor for liberty. Tom Paine went further. He rejected the authority of a parliament and system of laws built on antiquarian principles, as Paine famously put it, and it's a quote that has informed numerous social causes and emancipatory agendas in the 20th century, including the African, the Dalit, and the subaltern movements around the world. As he says, I am contending for the rights of the living and against their being willed away and controlled and contracted for by the manuscript assumed authority of the dead. On what ground of right then could the Parliament of 1688 or any other parliament bind all posterity forever? He's asking the question that we have seen African Americans and the subalterns, including the Dalits, ask in India. What is the value of a system of laws, of social regulation built upon the dead past, built upon documents which are no longer relevant? However, the conservatives such as Burke express faith in the old institutions of England. Tom Paine had noted that the British monarchy was redundant and that it's time to end this kind of rule. He described state of social inequities as unacceptable. Paine emphasized that when despotism becomes established, all institutions are also likely to become despotic. This is what he says. I quote, "When despotism has established itself for ages in a country, as in France, it is not in the person of the king only that it resides. It has the appearance of being so in show and in nominal authority, but it's not so in practice." Then he says, that is, despotism has its standard everywhere. Every office and department has its despotism, founded upon custom and usage. Paine supported the revolution in France for having restored the natural order of things. And this is what he says. What were formerly, and I quote, and this is up on your slide, what were formerly called revolutions were little more than a change of persons or an alteration of local circumstances. What we now see in the world from the revolutions of America and France are a renovation of the natural order of things, a system of principles as universal as truth and the existence of man, and combining moral with political happiness and national prosperity. We have had reasons to look at this quote before, where he's speaking explicitly about the link between the moral and political happiness. While Tom Paine's polemic was directed primarily at the system of government and national politics, other commentators were concerned with a very different but related realm within the domain of rights. Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women, 1792, now seen as a pioneer text in the feminist movement, and poems like Anne Letitia Above All the Rights of Women call for a rethinking of the role of education, rationality, and political participation. Barbara worded her call to women in martial terms. And this is again something we have looked at, but I put it back on the slide because it's a very important passage. Note, like I said, the tone of injury, sympathy, anger. But the language is also of empire, command, artillery, and thundering cannon. There's a martial tone to all of this. Wollstonecraft accepted that women rarely attend to anything with a degree of exactness that men do. This, she claims, is due to the fact that men are from their infancy trained to observe and function in certain ways. Women who learn by snatches, as she puts it, and whose learning is only a secondary thing, do get the opportunity to train their minds better. She therefore calls for sustained attention to the education of women. Here is your next slide, and this is what Mary Wollstonecraft says. For, if it be allowed that women were destined by Providence to acquire human virtues, and by the exercise of their understandings that stability of character, which is the firmest ground to rest our future hopes upon, they must be permitted to turn to the fountain of light, and not forced to shape their course by the twinkling of a mere satellite. Note, Wollstonecraft is already anticipating what people like Virginia Woolf, Simone de Beauvoir and others would say in the 20th century. One is never born, but one becomes a woman, in Beauvoir's famous phrase. But what Wollstonecraft is saying is, there are social apparatuses, ideological apparatuses like education, which cause women to think in certain ways, because they train women in certain ways. Men, as she puts it, are from their very infancy trained to observe and function in certain ways. So are the women. So unless you change the educational system, unless you change the way training is given to women, women will continue to be subservient. So by drawing attention to the absence of equal opportunities for women, Wollstonecraft was able to underscore social conditions where women were condemned to be perpetually slaves. So if Tom Paine called for a change in the government for equal rights to the people, Wollstonecraft called for a revolution in the social order. So you can't just say that men and women are equal if you do not give equal training. The Monthly Review wrote about it. In fact, it praised it for what was going on. And this is your next slide. This is a brief review from 1792 about quote-unquote women's rights such as they were, but a direct reference to Wollstonecraft's work. And that's your quote up there on the slide. Philosophy, which for so many ages has amused the indolent recluse with subtle and fruitless speculations, has at length stepped forth into the public walks of men, and offers them her friendly aid in correcting those errors which have hitherto retarded the progress towards perfection, and in establishing those principles and rules of action by which they may be gradually conducted to the summit of human felicity. What is that quote doing? What they're saying is basically what Wollstonecraft has already said. The necessity of training women to acquire what they are calling conducted to the summit of human felicity. It is not an innate or immanent feature of the women to behave the way they do. It is the result of a particular kind of social training, particular kind of training by institutions such as the family, the church, or the educational system that produces these kinds of women. The poets themselves, but principally Wordsworth, have in the recent past attracted quite a lot of opprobrium for their attitudes towards women. In Wordsworth's Lucy poems, for instance, Lucy is named only towards the end, and then she leaves. The famous poems, 3 years she grew and she dwelt among, and so on and so forth. John Powell Ward rightly terms this as Wordsworth's naming and leaving tendency. As in, you don't do much more with Lucy, because Lucy occurs only at the end of the poem, the name that is. In his poetry, says Ward, the woman arrives and leaves at once, and others, in other poems, where she's always present simply because she can't move. So in response to people like Burke, Wollstonecraft and Tom Paine turned Burke's nationalist rhetoric against itself and said, perhaps you need to take a look at the way justice is contested or has to be contested in national identity, economy and literature, and so on and so forth. What is it we are looking at here? Think in terms of a system of social order where things like education, the family, the church, that is religion, organized religion, encouraged and justified patriarchy or slavery. It suggested that there has to be a natural order of things in which there was a working class at the lower end of the scale, women at the lower end of the scale, and the elite up there. People like Tom Paine, when speaking about the universal rights of the human race, And Wollstonecraft, speaking specifically about the question of women, moved the focus away from philosophical speculations about what the human is to questions of social order and the questions of social justice. That is, you cannot think in terms of abstract notions of justice until you pay attention to the social order. So even when people like Wordsworth are, what John Watt said, naming and leaving women in their poems, they are part of a thinking, part of a social imaginary where women are meant to be named and left and are not of much consequence. So as you can see, the debate on rights was wide-ranging. We have not looked at something that has emerged in the last few years, the last decade, on animals and the romantic imagination. David Perkins and others have written about it, on animal rights, which also begins to find its space within this particular period. But that's subject for an entirely different talk. For now, let's think in terms of what Tom Paine is doing, what Burke is saying, and what Wordsworth and others are saying, and of course the woman's response. Tom Paine is arguing that the system of government creates a certain kind of social order. And his point, his crucial point is, oppression is not only embedded or embodied in the person of the king. It's there across the social spectrum. It's there in every organized form, as in it's there in everyday life. In response, Mary Wollstonecraft will again point to the social order and say, women do not have adequate rights. As we have seen in Anna Laetitia Barbault's poem, she urges the women to rise up. Her military tone may have been at some point, I guess, looking at the late 18th and early 19th century, not received very well. You do not expect the woman to rebel, and so on and so forth, but was definitely making a claim that women should also claim their rights. In poems like Felicia Hemans' The Indian City, you again have a woman warrior. So there are tropes from that period which you must pay attention to in order to understand that the debate on rights clearly manifest in the literature of the time. So for all our understanding, traditional understanding of the English romantics as more or less non-political lovers of nature, steeped in ideas about the consciousness and sentiment, there is a very strong political angle to much of their poetry, as this contextual lecture has shown you. Thank you.